After America is made on the lands of the Kure, Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. It has been, as they say, a week. The deification of Charlie Kirk is being confirmed at a Super Bowl-like funeral, with a list of speakers including the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defence, the Vice President, and the President himself. In a place where gun violence is a daily, generally unremarkable occurrence, that's quite the list.
Charlie started a political movement but unleashed a spiritual revival.
He did not hate his opponents. He wanted the best for them. That's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry. I am sorry, Erica.
For Charlie, we will rebuild this United States of America to greatness. For Charlie, we will never shrink, we will never cower, and we will never falter, even when staring down the barrel of a gun.
Charlie's murder was not just an attack on one man or one movement. It was an attack on our entire nation. It was an assault on our most sacred liberties and God-given rights. The gun was pointed at him, but the bullet was aimed at all of us. That bullet was aimed at every one of us.
Meanwhile, the United Nations General Assembly is convening for the 80th time. After a rocky week for Australian diplomacy, Anthony Albanese is in New York. Australia has now recognised the state of Palestine, committed to some 2035 climate targets, and the Prime Minister is now eagerly waiting to meet the President. Joining me this week to talk about Kirk, the state of American democracy, the United Nations General Assembly, and Australia's diplomacy in the Pacific is my friend and colleague, Allan Behm. Hi, Allan. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Emma. Good to see you.
Always good to see you. Allan, I wanted to start this morning at the time of recording with Australia's recognition, finally, of the state of Palestine, joining 150 other odd countries that have recognised Palestine, including this week the United Kingdom, Canada, and we think soon France, Portugal, and Belgium as well. Israel is increasingly isolated, but in the short term, this doesn't appear to be having an effect. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, Emma, we should just go back a little bit and recognise that the recognition of Palestine as a move in Australian foreign policy has been around for quite a long time. It has quite a long history, and interestingly, there are elements of both the major political parties and, of course, the Greens who have been strongly in favour of recognition for quite a long time. It's been part of the ALP policy platform for nearly 2 decades, and certainly if you look at Friends of Palestine movement in the federal parliament, it's been a cross-party group for a very long time. So this is not a novelty. It's been a long time coming. It's not the best time for it, though, because in some respects, an earlier recognition would have clarified our current position in a way that having to do it in the terrible circumstances of the destruction of Palestine make it more a gesture than something that contributes to the long-term benefit of the Palestinians. What we have here, I think, is a deeply political gesture on the part of Australia and countries with which Australia is close friends to put additional pressure on the Prime Minister of Israel to terminate the war in Palestine and to move towards a much more constructive approach to the resolution of these very, very long-term issues around who occupies the Middle East and on what terms and conditions. So there would be nobody, I think, who thinks that the recognition of Palestine is going to make any immediate difference whatsoever. It is clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu is obdurate, that he will not accept any pressure at all to recognise Palestine as part of Israeli policy. Indeed, it is more likely that he will get on with the business of the further obliteration of Gaza, I think. And to that extent, as I was hinting at earlier, coming so late to recognition is a tool for putting pressure on Israel, but it will do nothing at this point for the Palestinians. And that, I think, is the very sad thing about this movement across the UN. It is a lot for people to do, so it's not a question of too little too late. It's really a question of too much too late. And I think for that reason, we should be thinking already of what the next steps are going to be in both resolving the underlying political issues in Palestine and then creating a Palestine which is capable of being self-governing. It is not capable now, and it won't be capable of being self-governing for at least a decade or two.
And I mean, as you've outlined, the Netanyahu government is clearly committed to making sure that Palestine is never in that position. You know, they've been very clear about that. And I mean, if we go to the next steps and continue to focus on Israel, that falling away of support for Israel is potentially catastrophic, you know, to lose support in the Security Council, for example, you know, of course, except for the United States, and to lose support from what have been long-time supporters of Israel in Europe and in Australia as well. What are the long-term consequences of that isolation for Israel? I mean, they can't be good.
Well, I'm particularly worried about that because as Israel becomes a pariah state, it is very likely, I think, that the current Israeli government will find itself even less constrained in the use of military force to achieve the outcome that it wants in Palestine. It's very hard to see that there's very much constraint anyway exercised by Israel at the moment. Its approach to clearing Gaza is extreme. The suffering of the people of Gaza is extraordinary, and our television sets every day are showing us the obliteration of virtually all of the civilian infrastructure of Gaza. I think the very dangerous thing here is the fact that Israel will push to the sea here and it will occupy the whole of Gaza and the West Bank, and that will provide the basis for future Israeli negotiations. When we were talking a couple of weeks ago, Emma, when Putin and Trump met in Alaska, you'll recall that one of the things we identified was the inability of Trump to recognise that the status quo ante in Ukraine, that is, the pre-war borders, could be a starting point for negotiation. What Trump and Putin seemed to agree was that the starting point for negotiation would be the borders as they currently stand. And I think that Netanyahu took quite a lot of heart from that. And that, I think, is the basis of Israel's current strategy of moving right across Gaza so that it will claim the West Bank and Gaza as being the territory of Israel as the starting point for its own negotiation. And that, I think, is going to be highly problematic.
Extremely problematic. But of course, you know, as you say, Israel seems to have the total support of the United States in that, and Trump himself particularly. And that support seems to be extending now to the United States attacking its allies for its positions on Palestine.
We've had 77 years of conflict. We need to end the cycle of violence. The way to do that is what Australia has had for a long time a bipartisan position of a two-state solution.
A bunch of Republicans in Congress here in the United States have written an open letter warning that this is a move that's going to imperil Israel's security, that there could be consequences from doing so. Does that worry you at all?
Well, we obviously have set Australia's foreign policy based on our interests and our values. And while everyone's entitled to their views, we will determine Australian foreign policy, not anyone else.
The Australian Prime Minister was sent a letter, for example, just before he got to New York, signed by a number of high-profile Republicans, including Republican Senator Ted Cruz, warning of quote-unquote punitive measures as a result of Australia's recognition of the Palestinian state. That seems to be quite a significant step for the United States to be lashing out like that. What do you make of that?
Look, when any state has got their back to the wall, they tend to lash out. That's certainly what Netanyahu has been doing, I think, in Israel. And we now see a very unusual circumstance where the United States is also quite isolated from its allies, and its response to that isolation, which is a new experience for the United States, is not to try to persuade its allies that they should adopt a different policy, but it is to threaten to punish them. It's sort of very Trumpian in a way, and it's very much the sort of macho approach to the management of international relations that you see in many other autocracies. And so for that reason, it's a very worrying new behaviour of the United States that it should not only diss its allies, which it has been for the last couple of years, but more significantly start to threaten its allies in the same way as it has long threatened its putative adversaries. And this, I think, is a very significant change in the American conduct of diplomacy.
And yet, the Australian government is still, it appears, eagerly anticipating a meeting with the president in New York, not in DC, interestingly. It seems likely that this issue will come up in that meeting. How do you anticipate that that's going to go? I mean, I find it extraordinary that, Australia seems to be so eager to meet with this president when, surely the best possible outcome from that meeting is that the Prime Minister is only a little bit humiliated and not catastrophically humiliated. Like, what is going on here? Why are we so desperate for this meeting?
Look, I think the government is desperate for a meeting with Trump because Australia's relationship with the United States is a kind of talisman for Australian foreign policy. If we're getting on swingingly with America, then we feel that we're getting on swingingly. And at the moment, we're not getting on swingingly with America because the American president will, not eagerly at least, meet with the Australian Prime Minister. Yet in previous administrations, previous presidents have come to Australia for the funeral of Australian Prime Ministers. So this is a very, very big change. I think the important thing for Prime Minister Albanese is to weigh up what the consequences of a mild humiliation might be as distinct from standing his ground and not being humiliated at all. What benefit is going to accrue to him or Australia from a meeting with President Trump when you have no way of determining how that meeting might go in advance? These things are normally very, very carefully choreographed, and nobody goes into a meeting apprehensive about what the outcome is going to be. We've seen what happened when Zelensky made his visit to the Oval Office earlier this year. That was a surprise. It was a surprise for everybody in the office, excepting, I think, for Donald Trump. So one of those, I think, has to be avoided. And I suspect at the moment the best outcome for Albanese would be to say, look, I don't think I really need a meeting with the President of the United States at this stage because the outcome will be determined more by the quality of the Big Macs and the Diet Coke than it will be by the substantive matters that we have to talk about, which is peace in the Middle East and more broadly, global peace and security. Since that is the point of Albanese's visit to the UN, he has a big counterfactual about to hit him over the head. And that is something that, were I advising him, I'd suggest he avoid.
If only you were advising him, Allan, because it doesn't seem like he will avoid it. And there are, of course, a number of topics that Australia should be talking to the United States about, peace in the Middle East, of course, being one of the most important ones. The other is potentially the state of American democracy and the projection of American democratic turmoil out into the world that was partly, at least, kind of almost symbolically embodied by that moment with Australian journalist John Lyons, someone you've worked with quite extensively, who has really an impeccable record of journalistic integrity, particularly, I think, in his coverage of Israel and Palestine, stands head and shoulders above many in Australia.
It's appropriate, President Trump, that a president in office should be engaged in so much business activity.
Well, I'm really not. My kids are running the business.
But you are also,
you know what the activity, where are you from?
I'm from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Four Corners program.
Well, the Australians, you're hurting Australia, right? In my opinion, you are hurting Australia very much right now. And they want to get along with me. Your leader is coming over to see me very soon. I'm going to tell him about you. You set a very bad tone.
Well,
go ahead, John.
Do you think that Trump's attack on Lyons and the way that was done will or should come up in that meeting if it does occur?
Really good question, Emma. The attack on John Lyons was intemperate, and that is characteristic of the way in which President Trump seems to conduct business. I would, again, not advise that the Prime Minister should raise that matter. It doesn't go to the heart of why the Prime Minister is in New York. The Prime Minister is in New York because of the Middle East problem. And, of course, what John Lyons was doing was raising a much more interesting domestic problem for Trump, and that is the extent to which he's been able to enrich himself through the life of his presidency. And that, I think, is not a central concern for the Prime Minister. So I probably wouldn't touch that issue. The issues that we've got to talk about with the United States have much more to do, I think, with how the Middle East problem is to be resolved, America's good offices in doing that, which can't be focused simply on Israel as a state, but it has to be focused on all of the other interested parties in the Middle East. And you've got to remember here that Israel, to the extent that it had any friends in the Middle East, now has none. It is isolated. And does the United States need itself to be isolated as both a backer and a broker? Really important question. And I don't think the United States has got a solution to that problem. The next set of issues that should be front and centre of Prime Minister Albanese's thinking is, of course, Australia's particular role in the Pacific and the role of the United States in the Pacific. These are big issues for Australia, and of course, they're the issues that are worth talking to the US President about. But I don't even think that they will get a mention. And hence, if they don't get a mention, the conversation is effectively purposeless.
I want to come back to the Pacific because I absolutely agree that that's a critical issue for Australia and should be for the United States, but certainly isn't. Just before we get to that, though, of course, Trump's not interested in any of those questions and so likely won't talk to the Australian PM or perhaps anyone about them. He is, of course, much more focused on the consolidation of his own power and will arrive in New York from the funeral of Charlie Kirk, which has occurred in this sort of very particularly American, almost Super Bowl fashion, with the president speaking, the vice president, a number of secretaries. We're seeing this extraordinary deification of a moderately successful podcaster. I've argued, and I've written about it this week, that this particular kind of coalescing, I suppose, of moments in American history is one that really reveals to us the catastrophic state of American democracy, when Trump and the people around him can use this incident as a pretext for the implementation of an authoritarian agenda in the United States.
Our lineage and our legacy hails back to Athens, to Rome. You have no idea the dragon you have awakened. You have no idea how determined we will be to save this civilization, to save the West, to save this republic. And to those trying to incite violence against us, those trying to foment hatred against us, what do you have? You have nothing. You are nothing. You are wickedness, you are jealousy, you are envy, you are hatred. You are nothing. You can build nothing. You can produce nothing. You can create nothing. We are the ones who build. We are the ones who create. We are the ones who lift up humanity.
And that is particularly grim and should be particularly worrying, I think, for Australia, given our relationship with the United States. What do you make of the response to Kirk's death and how the Trump administration does appear to be so effectively weaponising it?
Well, it certainly is, and the word you used, I think, is completely correct. Kirk has been deified. The idea that every schoolyard in Utah should have a statue of Charlie Kirk is a bit like having a statue of Jesus in schools around religious countries. It's an extraordinary thing to do. So the politicisation of this event has been, I think, consistent with the other hallmarks of Trump's administration. This is something that Trump and his cronies are extremely good at. They know how to get hold of an issue which for many people might appear to be a bit on the edge. I mean, was it an assassination or was it simply a murder? It's a pretty important distinction. Was it an act of politically motivated violence, to wit, a kind of terrorism, or was it a person for a whole lot of other reasons killing another person who'd irritated him? I mean, we don't know any of the answers to those questions because we've had no legal process yet. But politically, the answers to those questions are clear.
Yeah.
And that is what happens when in an authoritarian society you grab hold of an event, you manipulate it, you transmogrify it into something that has much, much greater national significance as a force for division than it has in itself as a very sad event. I mean, there's no doubt that, the public killing of somebody is a shocking thing to happen in any society. But in this particular case, a really shocking event is now being glorified. And it's an extraordinary thing to think that the United States, with all of the constitutional protections for freedom of speech and freedoms of all kinds built in over 250 years, they're all being thrown on their face, and we're now having a president freewheeling in the creation of an autocracy in the Western Hemisphere. Really quite extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And I never know, Allan, whether I should even bother pointing out the hypocrisy of what is happening, when these figures on the right, Trump himself, but so many others have positioned themselves as champions of free speech and the First Amendment. And, we've known all along that they didn't care about any of that. Is there any point in highlighting that hypocrisy?
Look, I always think there is, because the fact of the matter is that more than half of the American population vote differently. We know that at the grassroots level, the American democracy is alive and well. It's distorted for the moment, and it may remain distorted because of the way in which gerrymanders and other political forces are applied to it. But at the basic level, Americans are still free to say and think what they want to say and think, and they are doing that. It's costing a few media personalities their careers, but whether it's Kimmel or Colbert, they will be up again to fight another day. They've already shown how successful they are in turning their own misfortunes into success, and that's the American way. So I think we've got to understand that American society itself is extremely complicated. It's got many, many dimensions to it, and it's got a natural capacity, I think, not only to survive, but actually to make good out of bad experiences. So Americans are deeply invested in that, and the friends of America, and that should include Australia, should be pretty deeply invested in that as well. That would be a very nice conversation between the Prime Minister and President Trump.
Oh, it would be an interesting conversation. Somehow I don't think it's going to happen at this particular meeting. And you mentioned earlier, to go back to that meeting, you mentioned earlier that Australia should be arguably talking to the United States about the Pacific in particular, which again probably won't happen, but we can talk about it. And you've written about it beautifully in the last week in the Guardian, particularly about two agreements between Australia and Pacific nations that fell over right at the last minute. I think listeners could be forgiven for having missed this in the avalanche of coverage of Kirk's death. Could you just explain to us what has happened, what has gone on in Australia's Pacific diplomacy in the last couple of weeks?
Well, in a funny way, Australia's Pacific diplomacy is something of an oxymoron. We really haven't had a terribly successful couple of weeks in the exercise of diplomacy in the Pacific. And I think it's quite a reasonable thing to observe that for all of his many political and other skills, the Prime Minister is not a natural diplomat. That consistent with many other Australian Prime Ministers, he tends to go into the Pacific thinking that we have the answers to all of the problems of the Pacific, when in fact we haven't even listened to the questions that the Pacific might ask of us. So we went into Vanuatu and to Papua New Guinea with the solution to a problem which neither of them really have. We've got the problem, but we don't articulate the problem clearly enough for Pacific countries to want to adopt our solutions. Our problem is that we want to jostle and bump into China in the Pacific. We don't know how to manage China in the Pacific. China certainly doesn't know how to manage us because we're effectively working at cross purposes in the Pacific on premises which the Pacific countries themselves don't like and don't want. So the idea that we want to support America in a great power competition with China in the Pacific is, effectively anathema to the countries of the Pacific because they get no benefit out of that. I'd argue that we don't get any benefit out of that either, because when you start competing with a country of 1.6 billion people, which is a rising power, both economically and strategically, you're never going to win in that competition. You might minimise your losses, but you'll never be in a position to maximise your gains. Diplomacy is about maximising gains. And the natural terms on which Australia can operate its diplomacy in the Pacific is much more through alignment with the Pacific partners than it is through contest against China. So the very way in which we're going about our diplomacy in the Pacific, I think, virtually guarantees failure. We might bludgeon them and eventually, grudgingly, they'll accept some outcome that appears to favour Australia, but they won't have their hearts in it, and they will just build up what is already very clear in the way in which Pacific countries look at Australia. They'll build up their resentment. And so all we're doing, I think, is creating further resentment for no singular advantage to either the Pacific countries or ourselves. That is pretty poor diplomacy. And for that reason, I think a conversation between the Prime Minister and President Trump around how you actually think about Pacific diplomacy could be a very rewarding experience for both of them.
Allan, one of the, or I guess the area where there is arguably the most misalignment between Pacific and Australian interests, if we could call them that, is of course climate change.
The continued mining and export of coal and gas by Australia creates a death warrant for Tuvalu.
How would you feel if a country that is meant to help, to protect, is the one slowly destroying you little by little?
I know we get development assistance to build our climate resilience. Isn't it funny that we're getting that assistance, but at the same time, you're doing the very thing that is destroying our homes? So maybe we are so stupid as not to see this.
I don't want my bones to be buried somewhere else. I want to be buried here. I want to live here because this is home. This is where I feel safe. This is everything to me.
At the UN General Assembly, the Prime Minister committed Australia to some 2035 emissions targets of 62 to 70% reduction on 2005 levels, which all the science tells us is inadequate. We know that's inadequate. You've worked for a climate change minister. How do you think Australia's commitments there would be understood by Pacific nations in the context of all you've just talked about?
Look, Emma, if it weren't so serious, the Pacific nations would regard our policy as laughable. But it isn't laughable because our policy is a minimalist policy. It has minimum effect and the maximum chance of being achieved as a policy, which means that it's really not going to do anything to anybody that will cut carbon emissions in a way that disadvantages those who are the biggest carbon producers and emitters. So we're not doing anything that meets the fundamental needs of the Pacific countries, 3 of which are subject to deep questions about their survivability. I mean, when we talk about existential threats, the clearest ones in the world at the moment are in the Pacific, in parts of Southeast Asia and in Africa, all for different reasons. It's water levels and sea levels in the Pacific. It's flooding in very many parts of Southeast Asia, and it's perpetual droughts in Africa. And these things are of critical importance, and countries such as Australia, rich, relatively small populations, much capacity to do things, lots of agency, simply are not stepping up to the task, not only about the survival of our neighbours, but indeed stepping up to the task of our own long-term survival with improvements in the quality of our survivability. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not survival at lower standards. What we've got to focus on is long-term survival at improved standards. And that is the nature of successful public policy. So in the Pacific, we damage ourselves by playing the wrong geostrategic game and playing the wrong climate game. And when you've got those 2 things working in combination, is it any wonder that the last couple of weeks have been disappointing from the perspective of Australia's Pacific diplomacy? Disappointing is a perhaps generous way to put it, but one might say disastrous. one might say that. And if listeners are interested to hear more about Australia's role and relationships in the Pacific, on Wednesday the 24th of September, the Australia Institute is hosting a special Politics in the Pub where we will be screening a new documentary called Save Tuvalu, Save the World. That will be in person in Canberra but also live streamed. So if you are interested in that, you can tap the link in the show notes. But on that note, Allan, thank you as always for your generosity in explaining the disasters of Australian diplomacy and the rest of the world to us. We always really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Emma. You can find all of the Australia Institute's research on the Pacific and climate policy more broadly on our website, which is australiainstitute.org.au. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 22nd of September. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.